Chapter 3. How Candide escaped from the Bulgars, and what happened to him. Nothing could have been more splendid, brilliant, smart, or orderly than the two armies. The trumpets, fifes, oboes, drums, and cannons produced a harmony whose equal was never heard in hell. First the cannons laid low about 6,000 men on each side, then rifle fire removed from the best of worlds about 9 or 10,000 scoundrels who had been infesting its surface. The bayonet was also the sufficient reason for the death of several thousand men. The total may well have risen to 30,000 souls. Candide, trembling like a philosopher, hid himself as best he could during this heroic carnage. Finally, while the two kings were having Te Deums sung, each in his own camp, Candide decided to go elsewhere to reason about cause and effect. He made his way over heaps of dead and dying men until he came to a nearby village. It was in ashes, for it was an Avar village, which the Bulgars had burned in accordance with international law. Old men with wounds all over their bodies were watching the death throes of butchered women who clutched their children to their bloody breasts, girls who had been disemboweled after satisfying the natural needs of several heroes were breathing their last sighs. Others, mortally burned, were shrieking for someone to hasten their death. The ground was strewn with brains and severed arms and legs. Candide fled to another village as fast as he could. It belonged to the Bulgars, and the Avar heroes had treated it in the same manner. Still walking over quivering limbs or through ruins, he finally emerged from the theater of war, carrying a little food in his sack and never forgetting Lady Cunegonde. His food ran out when he reached Holland, but since he had heard that everyone was rich in that country, and that the people were Christians, he did not doubt that he would be treated as well there as he had been in the Baron's castle before he had been driven away from it because of Lady Cunegonde's lovely eyes. He asked alms of several solemn individuals, who all replied that if he continued to ply that trade he would be shut up in a house of correction to teach him better manners. Next he approached a man who had just spoken about charity for a whole hour in front of a large assembly. This orator scowled at him and said, "What are you doing here? Are you for the good cause?" "There is no effect without a cause," replied Candide modestly. "All things are necessarily connected and arranged for the best. I had to be driven away from Lady Cunegonde, I had to run the gauntlet, and I have to beg my bread until I can earn it. All that could not have been otherwise." "My friend," said the orator, "do you believe that the Pope is the Antichrist?" "I have never heard anyone say so," answered Candide, "but whether he is or not, I still have nothing to eat." "You don't deserve to eat," said the orator. "Go, you scoundrel, you wretch, and never come near me again." The orator's wife, having looked out the window and seen a man who doubted that the Pope was the Antichrist, poured on his head the contents of a full. O heaven, to what excesses are ladies driven by religious zeal! A man who had not been baptized, a good Anabaptist by the name of James, witnessed this cruel and ignominious treatment of one of his fellow men, a featherless biped who had a soul. He took him to his home, washed him, served him bread and beer, made him a gift of 2 florins, and even offered to teach him to work for him in the manufacture of those Persian fabrics that are produced in Holland. Candide almost threw himself at his feet. "Dr. Pangloss was right when he told me that all is for the best in this world," he said, "because your extreme generosity has moved me much more deeply than the harshness of that gentleman in the black cloak and his wife." The next day, as he was taking a walk, he met a beggar covered with sores. His eyes were lifeless, the tip of his nose had been eaten away, his mouth was twisted, his teeth were black, his voice was hoarse, he was racked by a violent cough, and he spat out a tooth with every spasm. Chapter 4. How Candide met his former philosophy teacher, Dr. Pangloss, and what ensued. Candide, moved even more by compassion than by horror, gave this appalling beggar the 2 florins he had received from James, the worthy Anabaptist. The apparition stared at him, shed tears, and threw his arms around his neck. Candide drew back in terror. "Alas," said one pauper to the other, "don't you recognize your dear Pangloss?" What are you saying? You, my dear master? You, in this horrible condition? What misfortune has befallen you? Why are you no longer in the most beautiful of castles? What has become of Lady Cunegonde, the pearl of young ladies, the masterpiece of nature? I'm at the end of my strength, said Pangloss. Candide immediately took him to the Anabaptist's stable, where he gave him a little bread to eat, and when he had revived, he said to him, Well, what about Cunegonde? She's dead, replied Pangloss. Candide fainted at this word. His friend brought him back to consciousness with some bad vinegar that happened to be in the stable. Candide opened his eyes and said, Cunegonde is dead. Oh, best of all possible worlds, where are you? But what did she die of? Was it from seeing me kicked out of the beautiful castle by her father? No, said Pangloss. She was disemboweled by Bulgar soldiers after having been raped as much as a woman can be. They smashed the Baron's head. When he tried to defend her, the Baroness was hacked to pieces, and my poor pupil was treated exactly the same as his sister. As for the castle, not one stone was left standing on another. There's not one barn left, not one sheep, not one duck, not one tree. But we were well avenged, because the Avars did the same thing to a nearby estate that belonged to a Bulgar lord. At this account Candide fainted again, but when he had regained his senses and said everything required by the situation, he inquired into cause and effect, and the sufficient reason that had reduced Pangloss to such a pitiful state. Alas, said Pangloss, it was love. Love, the consoler of the human race, the preserver of the universe, the soul of all sensitive beings, tender love. Alas, said Candide, I, too, have known love, that ruler of hearts, that soul of our soul. It's never brought me anything except 1 kiss and 20 kicks in the rump. How could such a beautiful cause produce such an abominable effect on you? Pangloss answered in these terms, My dear Candide, you knew Paquette, our noble Baroness's pretty maid. In her arms I tasted the delights of paradise, and they produced these torments of hell with which you see me devoured. She was infected with them, and by now she may have died of them. It was a present given to her by a learned Franciscan friar who had derived it from the point of origin, for it was given to him by an old countess who received it from the cavalry captain who owed it to a marquise, who got it from a page, who was given it by a Jesuit who while still a novice, had received it in a direct line from a shipmate of Christopher Columbus. As for me, I won't give it to anyone because I'm dying. Oh, Pangloss, cried Candide, what a strange genealogy! Didn't it begin with the devil? Not at all, replied the great man. It was an indispensable element in the best of worlds, a necessary ingredient, because if Columbus, on an American island, hadn't caught the disease which poisons the source of generation, which often even prevents generation, and which is obviously opposed to the great goal of nature, we would now have neither chocolate nor cochineal. It must also be noted that so far, on our continent, this disease is peculiar to us, like religious controversy. The Turks, Indians, Persians, Chinese, Siamese, and Japanese are still unacquainted with it, but there's a sufficient reason for their also coming to know it within a few centuries. Meanwhile, it's made amazing progress among us, especially in those great armies composed of honest and well-bred mercenaries, which decide the fate of nations. It can safely be said that whenever 30,000 men fight a pitched battle against an equal number of enemy troops, there are about 20,000 syphilitics on each side. That's admirable, said Candide, but you must be cured. How can I be? Said Pangloss. I'm penniless, my friend, and nowhere on the face of the globe can you get a bloodletting or an enema without paying or having someone pay for you. This statement decided Candide. He went back to James, the charitable Anabaptist, threw himself at his feet, and painted such a heart-rending picture of the state of his friend, the state to which his friend had been reduced, that the good man did not hesitate to take Dr. Pangloss into his house and have him cured at his expense. When his treatment was over, Pangloss had lost only an eye and an ear. He could write well and knew arithmetic perfectly. The Anabaptist made him his bookkeeper. 2 months later he was obliged to go to Lisbon on business. He took the 2 philosophers with him on his ship. Pangloss explained to him how all was for the very best. James did not share this opinion. Men, he said, must have corrupted nature a little, because they weren't born wolves, yet they've become wolves. God didn't give them 24-pounders or bayonets, but they've made themselves bayonets and cannons and with which to destroy each other. I might also mention bankruptcies and the law which takes over a bankrupt's property to defraud his creditors of it. All that was indispensable, replied the one-eyed doctor, and individual misfortunes create general welfare, so that the more individual misfortunes there are, the more all is well. While he was reasoning thus, the air grew dark, the winds blew from the 4 corners of the earth, and the ship was assailed by a terrible storm in sight of the port of Lisbon.